So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, David Ewing Duncan. He's an award-winning journalist, author of 6 books. His work has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Smithsonian, National Geographic, The Telegraph, The Guardian. It goes on and on and on, but I'll just say he is a very experienced journalist, reporter, and a very savvy interviewer when it comes to the biotech industry, and has a long and storied career working with many of these topics. David, would you like to take it away with today's panel?
Thank you very much. So I'm not sitting up here alone. Can I invite my panelists to mosey on up here? I think this is where we need some music.
Yeah.
And I think literally we had people walk down the stairs here and some travel. Is this on? Okay, yes, there we go. It was a good job of moseying there. Oh good, we have enough seats, okay. It is an incredible honor for me to be here and moderating this panel, this very exquisite panel. I'm a historian by training, and later in life learned enough about science to be able to fool most of the people some of the time, I guess, writing about science. But it is my first love and passion is history, and especially the seminal moments in history. When you look at the broad sweep, fairly recently, things like the invention of the steam engine, other major events, certainly the events that we're going to talk about tonight are one of those moments, the confluence of biology, which began in the 19th century and moved its way into the mid-20th and into this wonderful era of the 70s. And I'm old enough to remember the 70s. It was quite an interesting era. And I'm sure that, I want to ask Herb a little later about some of the pictures of him in those days, standing with big hair, big beard, bell-bottom jeans, next to a guy in a suit. Was that not you? No, you're in a suit now. Anyway, so things do change. But why don't we jump right into this? I want to start, there's a little bit of an arc here that I want to try to travel. But I think where we need to start, as we always do, is with the science. And I want to ask Herb and Stan, and you guys should almost be sitting next to each other, but that's okay. We got Niels in between you just in case you get ornery. I'd like to ask the two of you to take us back to the early 70s. It was a very interesting and odd time. We talked about the social context. Richard Nixon was president. They had the Vietnam War. I think Led Zeppelin had put out a couple of albums, Neil Young, etc. All of that going on. And then you had some really exciting things happening in your very labs at UCSF and Stanford. Tell us what the excitement was all about. Why are we even here? Where did this begin? Herb, you made the first noise. You get to go first.
Is this on? Can you hear? That's a tough question, David. It's hard to remember what was exciting then, but there were a lot of things were exciting. But ostensibly, this is about history, and I just came from a conference at Cold Spring Harbor on the history of restriction enzymes for their History of Science Center. And when I was preparing for that, I came across an aphorism which some of you may know and some of you may not know, but I thought it was very appropriate. And I have the name of the fellow who came up with this aphorism, but it's on my iPhone, but I don't have it in my head. I keep most of my stuff on the iPhone these days, but I can't keep it in my head very long. His aphorism was, he said, history is truth, but truth is not in history. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as we reminisce tonight. This may be worked over reminiscences, but I often think of those times. They were probably the most exciting times of my life because they were the most troublesome. I remember trying to purify restriction enzymes, and everybody was beating me to it. And when we did purify one of the enzymes, we found out that it really didn't make breaks in the DNA where it bound to the DNA, and so we were somewhat discouraged by that because that was our original goal, was to purify these two proteins, restriction enzymes and modification methylases. And the idea was to purify these enzymes, and since they both recognize the same sequence of DNA, we would have two different proteins recognizing the same segment of DNA. And if we could purify these enzymes and co-crystallize them with their substrate, we'd be able to understand some of the rules for how these proteins recognize DNA. And this was the hot topic of the day, mostly from bacterial work dealing with repressors and DNA and so on. So fortunately, I was at UCSF, and I'll tell you what happened that made it exciting. And you mentioned the Vietnam War at this time, occurring at this time. UCSF was not quite the hotbed as Berkeley was, but UCSF had a number of people protesting against the war and so on and so forth. And there were all of these events at UCSF happening, talks and so on and so forth, and rallies. And I remember marching in a few parades myself. But when we were asked to go out and work the neighborhoods where we lived and get petitions signed, people, what are you talking about? What's this all about? So there was this internal turmoil at UCSF, and this was all happening during the time Stan and I, or actually before we started working together, but up through that time. I thought back and I thought all this time, were very tumultuous times, yet this was the time we were doing probably our most creative work, at least for me, anyhow. So there was this contrast, and I realized the excitement was part of this anti-war fervor, and also the fervor that we had for understanding basic mechanisms, molecular mechanisms in biology. But being at UCSF was, I'll tell you a story. And so we had this disappointment in not having these proteins that we had purified cut the DNA where they were recognizing it. So I had a graduate student, Bob Yoshimori, and he was a clinician. He had a master's degree in clinical microbiology. And we knew at the time that there were several Japanese scientists that had discovered restriction enzymes in bacteria carrying resistant transfer plasmids. And so I thought, well, let's have a look at those. Nobody had worked with them other than the original report. And it was the first report of an enzymatic activity before methylcysteine actually. So I sent Bob down to the clinical labs because I wasn't going near those infectious agents in the clinical lab. So Bob went, and with his expertise, he came back with approximately 30-some bacterial colonies that had multiple drug-resistant genes. And we screened those, and we found 5 that had restriction modification activity. 4 were so-called ECHO-R2. These had been a specificity recognized prior to that. But we found one, that was ECHO-R1 enzyme, which sort of made Stan and I get together eventually. So the ECHO-R1 enzyme was actually isolated from an E. coli strain related to the strains we were using in the laboratory at the time. But this E. coli strain came from a patient that had a urinary tract infection and had gone to UCSF for treatment. And the clinicians had isolated this microorganism. And it turns out that it carried the ECHO-R1 enzyme. it's never really, it was found in one other place subsequent to that, and it was a totally different enzyme, recognized the same sequence. So I realized a year or two later that if Bob had gone down to the clinical lab at UCSF a week before or a week after he did, we wouldn't have the echo R1. So that was the excitement of the time. And there was just a lot of great science going in the Department of Biochemistry and microbiology as well. And it was a time in which we didn't mind spending 10, 12 hours a day in the lab, 6, 7 days a week, because it was just a lot of fun. I realized later that almost half our time was spent preparing reagents to do experiments, and today all you have to do is either get on the telephone or email your request, and it's there next day by Federal Express, and you can do your experiments. So times were very different then. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of fun, but a lot of it was just scut work. Even, graduate students always complained about having to do that, and postdocs have complained about doing that, but I did it too. So I did a lot of stuff.
I think we all end up doing that. But so the panel here, we're going to be talking about this interesting balance, tension, whatever you want to call it, between academia and so-called peer research, and what happens when you commercialize or translate some of that. And Stan, just to follow up on this, maybe you could set us up a little bit for why this science became important for that.
Yeah. Well, if I hadn't realized before Herb's comments that we might have met in a protest march instead of in Hawaii a few years later. But it's hard now to go back 40 years. But those of you who are old enough to remember may remember that in the 1960s, when we both arrived at our respective institutions, the world of molecular biology was really largely a world of phage. The term molecular biology itself had, I guess, been coined in the late 1950s, and the Journal of Molecular Biology, which really was started after the work of Jacob and Monod, and the whole field that was burgeoning in that period, was really this was relatively a new field. And I had worked on phage as a postdoc, and when I arrived at Stanford, I decided that I was interested in studying drug-resistant plasmids. And I spoke with a senior colleague in another basic science department whom I had known prior to going to Stanford, and he said to me, "Stan, you really shouldn't work on plasmids. Everything that's important to know about plasmids must already be known. So why don't you work on something important?" And so, but I was interested in drug resistance plasmids and in understanding the basis for drug resistance. And as Herb has already said, we got together some years later at, not too many years later, at a meeting on plasmid biology that Don Holinsky and Satuma Watanabe and I had organized in Hawaii, and that we invited Herb to because of his work on EcoR1 and the plasmid that encoded it. And this led to often described discussion during a long walk to a delicatessen near Waikiki Beach, where we began our collaboration. And I can say, because that was the most exciting time of my life. It was really a time when we were all excited about the experiments, and as I've written some things that some of you may have read, I really couldn't wait for the bacteria to grow more quickly. I would arrive in the lab, and Herb talks about staying late. Yes, and it also meant getting up early in the morning and staying late, and getting up early in the morning and coming to the lab and looking at the plates and seeing these tiny colonies and wishing that the bacteria would grow more quickly so that we could do our analysis. And it's hard to convey at this point, but I think you see that Herb and I still feel the sense of excitement that existed at the time of that collaboration and our experiments.
So, Niels, I want to turn to you for a second about, you read about this in the newspaper, right? That's the story I heard in the New York Times. And so you read about some of the work these two gentlemen were doing and some others, and you thought that this maybe could be commercialized. And I was wondering if you could describe that story. And this was pretty radical at the time to think this way. Why did you get this idea?
Well, our news director would send around articles. He was a rabid reader, and he would send around articles that perhaps pertain to technology to me. And there was this one from the New York Times, and I thought it looked very interesting. I called up Stan, and Stan said, it is beyond interesting for me. Hello. I'm very proud of it, and but I don't want patents involved. And that started me on a long period of time to finally convince Stan and Herb. But beyond that, it was much more complicated. The research was funded by NIH, NSF, another agency. Co-inventor was from UC San Francisco, and I needed to understand the technology. In that summer of '74, Stan gave me a copy of Watson's Molecular Biology of the Gene, so I learned the terms.
Did you read it all?
I did go through it, believe it or not. But a lot of terms that are conventional today didn't exist. For example, biotech, and I understand David Perlman is here. Are you here, David? He was on the list. I believe it was David Perlman that of the San Francisco Chronicle that first used the term biotech. And David, by the way, is going to be 95 in a few more weeks. He's really the dean of scientific. Here he comes. Hello, David. We're just talking about you. I'm accusing you of having come up with the term biotech. Is that correct? I think it is. So by the time I got through with the different agencies, worked that out, met with the UC system-wide patent office, negotiated with them. They said we could take it on and we could manage the licensing, but it would be totally at our risk. We could not recover any of our expenditures except against income that would come in. And then the net royalties would be divided 50-50. We also had to deal with some other matters, and including the filing of the agreement of the inventors, filing of the patent. They had published in November of '73. We got on file 1 week before the absolute bar.
So, by the way, I did want to mention that bios for all of the our panelists are in your program. So, we didn't give a formal introduction, but I think you know who most of these people are anyway. Let me turn. So we heard about the excitement of the science. We heard about how Niels saw this and decided to do this at the time rather unique. Had this rather unique approach of patenting this. So, what was the response, I wonder, to all of this by administrators, by those that maybe were more in the academic or research camp? And I know, Reg and Keith, I'm going to ask you about this, and I know that you all are big supporters and advocates of all that's happened. And it's hard not to be, given some of the numbers, which I'm going to give in a minute, of, say, the Cohen-Boyer patent alone, the business and therapies and other things that have emerged from that one patent alone. But I wonder if you all would mind taking us back you two, what it was like for you, maybe slightly later. I think you were maybe more late 70s, mid 70s, early? No? Even? Okay. I was trying to make you younger, Reg. But maybe you could take us back to the environment, because now it seems second nature, especially here in the Bay Area, for scientists to move into the entrepreneur camp and somewhat back and forth. But this was not the way it was really done in those days. And maybe you could tell us about why you maybe or others oppose this sort of arrangement.
Well, I think we all thought Herb was a little bit nuts, actually. It didn't seem, it seems now, of course, he was fantastically insightful, but in those times I wished I could have recognized that, but we didn't. I thought he was a little bit looped, right? Because here, and to try and give an example, it's a little bit now, if I were to suggest to Herb that I've got this way of implanting electrodes into the pleasure center, and so I can just stimulate it so people don't ever need to go to a baseball game or anything, or ever again, they could just stimulate their pleasure centers, Herb would think this guy's nuts, right? And I think this is because it was such a big jump from where we were at the time. And I think we want to say this because everybody comes on and wants to see how much they appreciate it. And, oh, yes, this was great. But in fact, a lot of us were really stupid at the time. And I was one of those.
Keith?
Let me give you a little bit deeper backdrop that I learned recently in connection with chairing a report for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And as the committee did its work and I got stuck writing the introductory chapter, I did some digging and I realized that there was an interesting kind of source disconnect in the culture and philosophy of the physical scientists and engineers from the life sciences as practiced in our case, but in medicine. And that was that the physical sciences and engineering always came at all of their problems from the most theoretical basis with an application, an endpoint in mind. Whereas in biology at that time, it was really regarded as an ivory tower intellectual endeavor. And I went to Princeton for graduate school, and it was literally the case that if anyone at Princeton were to breathe of an aspiration to do something applied with their research, it was a clear admission of intellectual weakness. It's true, and so in fact the two cultures developed in very different ways. And so Steve is right that that biotech represents a huge revolution, but it wasn't just a revolution in the invention of a technology that has had such amazing power, but it was a transition for biology, life sciences, to become a field where there could be real application that could affect people's lives and the economy and a whole bunch of other things. And so that transition was really dramatic. So and in fact, we're still paying the price of those two cultures as we now work harder and harder to try to do things to be able to bring together the physical sciences and the life sciences. And so with that backdrop, let me just say that I was opposed strongly to when I first learned of what Herb was doing, and that he was going to start this company. And I was about 3 or 4 months into my appointment as an assistant professor in the biochemistry department. And so I thought, well, this is very straightforward. Herb just obviously hasn't thought of the terrible conflicts and how this is going to be a disaster for the community. And so I went to the weekly meeting of the biochemistry department. There were about 9 people in the department back then, and we sat around and I made this proposal that just wouldn't be allowed. Clearly it hadn't been thought through carefully enough, and we should outlaw it. It would be a problem for inquiry, for training students. and a lot of other things. And I think the vote was 7-2 against my proposal. I was shocked, and I went away kind of scratching my head, but I was just a twerp a few months into my appointment, and so I just went back to my lab and tried to make as much trouble for Herb as I could, but but not obviously. You can see how effective I was, and an interesting thing is that I actually believe that what Herb and Stan were doing obviously was spectacularly important and good. And I also happen to believe that what my concerns were also well-founded at the time. And just like I am probably an outlier in believing that the moratorium on recombinant DNA and the Silmar Conference and all of the things that generated a halt to research for a time, I happen to believe that was a good endeavor and showed the kind of social maturation of our discipline and profession. I believe that the debate that got pretty strenuous at times at UCSF about this, and subsequently in other Cambridge and other places as well, was healthy, and that it led people to think hard about what these issues were and what the kind of scope of things that we need to be considering in thinking about how we do our science and what the consequences are for society. And I think that thinking was good. I think that it may have, to whatever extent it may have delayed work or delayed the starting or the prospering of companies. Obviously, it didn't have a big impact, but I think that the debate was well worth it. So I think that, and some of you know that I'm now Vice Chancellor for Research, and one of my major responsibilities is ensuring that a robust interface is built between what it is that we do in our laboratories here and being able to transfer that knowledge, those inventions, out into the public sector. And it really says that we've matured to a point where the potential conflicts that are there, are things that we need to acknowledge and manage. They're not going to go away. There's always the danger, the risk that something could go wrong in the training of students and so forth. But that being aware of that and acknowledging it and managing it is one of the things that we need to be able to do for the whole thing to move forward. So I've journeyed a long way, but I believe that early debate was something that was very healthy and worthwhile.
Yeah, Stan?
Yeah, the transition that Keith mentioned was remarkably rapid. I remember in 1975, I attended a symposium in Boston in which the fact that Stanford had put in a patent application on behalf of both of our universities had been mentioned. And it was widely criticized that basic research results should be patented. And I remember David Baltimore was chairing the session, and he said, well, I think there's someone in the room who can have some comments on that. And he said, is Stan here? So I was standing in the back of the auditorium, and I walked very slowly to the front, trying to think of what I was going to say. And it's interesting that just 2 years later, probably a third of the people in the audience had started their companies. And so there was really a remarkable transition. And as Niels has already said, when he contacted me after that article was published in the New York Times, I said, well, look, can results of basic research supported by NIH funds be patented? And should they be? And this research was dependent on decades of research on DNA, on plasmids, on restriction enzyme. And Niels said, well, all of patents are dependent on prior work. Nothing is ever invented in a vacuum, and there are procedures that determine whether there's a novel idea or not a novel idea. And why don't we proceed and let this all sort itself out? And I called Herb, and he agreed that we should do that. And at that point, Niels and his colleagues at UCSF got involved in discussions, and you all know what subsequently happened. But there was a remarkable change in perspective about commercializing the fruits of basic research in biology within a very short period of time.
And it's interesting, even covering this story, though, I started covering this in the late 90s, which is quite a bit longer. I was still feeling some tension even then and even now. Poor Kathy, by the way, is sitting at the end there, and she's going to come in here in a little bit, but she wasn't around doing research, I think, in the early 70s, but we'll get to her. So, yes, Niels.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about your question and the atmosphere at the time. Stanford throughout has been active in working with industry, but it was new certainly in biology, biochemistry. The problem at the time, which led to some very tense meetings, was that Stan was an outlier. He was in clinical pharmacology. He was not in biochemistry. And that set up a very difficult time, and was finally resolved. I won't go into the details of it.
Okay. Well, in fact, I wanted to ask Stan and Herb both. Obviously, you guys got involved with companies very early on, especially Stan. You were an advisor to Cetus, I think, back, 71, 72, that early?
A little later than that, David.
Okay, 73. 75. Okay. See,
Sally, it's good.
We have so many people here in the audience who could actually
need a historian with all of the information.
Fill this in. Well, so that was around the time of Genentech. But it's one thing to be sitting at your bench or whatever, doing your research in your academic institution. But it's quite another, especially in Herb's case, of co-founding a company. How did that fly? I mean, you're moving pretty fast here. First, the idea of patents, commercialization, and then suddenly companies.
Well, before Herb tells you about Genentech, let me just make a comment addressing your question. That, as Keith has already mentioned, there was a lot of biohazard concern at that time. And I was one of a group of scientists who would, I'll use the word lobby, in the political arena, trying to dissuade those people in the California legislature and people in Congress from passing legislation that would have been restrictive on research in all of our labs. And when I say restrictive, I mean that. They were going to, one of the laws proposed in California would have had the people who monitor beauty parlors and barber shops come into our labs and determine whether they were clean enough to do this kind of research. And so one of the first things that would happen when I would appear in a congressman's office or talk to a Senate committee is they would say, well, have you started any companies and how much do you stand to make from this enterprise, Dr. Cohen? And that is really, frankly, one of the reasons why I decided to not become involved in a startup company, but to being a consultant was okay. I mean, that was traditional. That was a traditional role for scientists in academia. But it was unusual at the time and courageous to do what Herb did and to actually start a company to exploit for the benefit of society the results of research in laboratories.
And I want to talk about the politics more in a minute because that was pretty interesting. It reached the Congress, and some cities actually, at least briefly, shut down research, including Cambridge and Massachusetts. But Herb, I want to talk about some of these pictures of that era. And I'm a very visual guy, having been a filmmaker at one time. And it's just...
Recognize me, right?
I did, actually. You haven't changed that much, except for the tie. I don't know if you would have worn a tie back in those days. But it is pretty remarkable to see those pictures of you in full 70s regalia, the young professor, and then Bob Swanson standing next to you with a suit on, a very dapper man. And the fact that you all came together and almost symbolized in those pictures is quite extraordinary. And we all know or at least many of us know the story of you guys chatting and retiring, I guess, to was it a bar? Or a restaurant, having the famous discussion over beers. You spend a lot of time in delis and bars, it seems like. But I was just... Yeah, nothing at all. I think it's great. But what caused you or drove you to actually take that extra step to become a co-founder of a company at that time? I mean, everybody does it now, but not at that time.
Well, I had to tell you a little anecdote. One of Stan's colleagues and mine, Stan Falco, had a great sense of humor. Still does, I guess.
He still does.
And I knew Stan when I was a postdoc back on the East Coast, and we had a common interest in fly fishing. So we spent some time talking about that, but we were talking about what we like to do, and Stan was interested in clinical microbiology, and very proud of it, and rightly so. But I remember the story he told me back then, and he said, you know, when I started in science, my mother and dad, they wanted to know what I was doing. And so I tried to explain to them that I was interested in how microorganisms were resistant to antibiotics, and there were the DNA molecules that got transferred from one cell to another. And he said by the time I got to that point, they were glazed over and not interested at all. So he said, I finally realized that next time they ask me that question, I'm going to tell them I'm looking for a cure for the common cold. And I always remember that story. So I used to always think about how could I explain what I'm doing to my mother and dad, and in particular my mother. I couldn't tell her, many of you won't remember this procedure, but I did a lot of interrupted mating experiments in those days. And so I had to tell them, I'm working, I remember Stan's comments, I'm working on a cure for the common cold. Well, never got there, but that idea never left me. So I remember talking to some of my colleagues. I remember talking to Howard Goodman in particular before we started Genentech, and Howard and I say, you know, how can we get this information into industrial companies, pharmaceutical companies, and surely it could be used for something. And so when Bob Swanson came along, I miss him. He was a good guy. We had a lot of good times together. He died way too young. But he came to me and he said, I'd like to start a company. And he said, I can get some money. We can start this company if you think this science that I've been reading about is ready for commercialization. I said, I think it is. Matter of fact, I said, I'm sure it is. And the reason for that conclusion was based on... Thank you. I'm not going to start over again. There were three technologies that created, use a bad analogy, a perfect storm. But the recombinant DNA technology was one, and the second was we had just done some work with synthetic DNA. We cloned synthetic DNA. This Dr. Heinecker sitting here was the man responsible for conducting all those experiments. And the third technology was sequencing of nucleotides in DNA. Those three technologies came together pretty much same time. Synthetic chemistry for DNA had existed for a number of years, but it was always very troublesome and difficult to do, but there had been a lot of improvements over the years. So those three technologies were what led me to think that a company that Bob and I were thinking about would be successful. We had no idea how long it would take. We just had some ideas about how we might go about doing it. One of the things I did, first thing I did, I went to Bill Rudder and I said, Bill, this other fellow and I, he's a venture capitalist. I said, I think I know what it means, but I'm not sure. But he said he had some money to start a company. So I'd like to start a company based on the technology. I said, what do you think? Is this going to be a problem? And Bill says, no, I think it's fine. He said, matter of fact, I always wanted to start a company myself. So he did, I think. So, and then we went off to see the chancellor and the dean of the medical school, and they were all okay with it, and had a little trouble with Howard Hughes Institute, which I was a fellow at the time. And then I had Bob go to the technology and licensing office at UC Berkeley to get contracts to seal the deal. And he also went to Caltech in the City of Hope to also do the contracts and licensing agreements. So then we got started, and we hired some young scientists and just let them run with it. And that's why we're here today. They did a terrific job.
How did UCSF react to this? And jump in, you guys from UCSF, if you want to too. What was the react? I mean, we all look back at Genentech as this shining beacon on the hill, given what happened later on. But in 1976, what was the reaction?
Let me just jump in because it was something that Herb just said. And a few days, I guess last Friday, I was in your position, David, and doing a public interview with Bill Rudder. And we talked about this very question, and people in the audience had asked about the tension and the issues and all the things. And I was amazed at what he said. He told the same story Herb did, that Herb came to him, that Bill was all in favor. He told him he wanted to start a company as well. He said the same things. And then we talked about the fact that Bill and I were on different sides of that debate, and that there was, as I said earlier, a strenuous discussion that ensued within UCSF. And then he said something amazing. He said that while the concerns that I and others were raising about what would happen to the subversion of student training and these things never happened, and they didn't. He said that he thinks that it needed time, that this was a debate that needed to happen and needed time, and he now feels that despite his own enthusiasm personally and for Herb's idea, that it probably wasn't the time to just be jumping right into it, but it was a debate that needed to happen, and that only time could allow these things to happen. So he just said, he concluded it was just too early, and we probably needed to have that discussion.
Yeah. Reg, what about? Tell us some of the reasons. We know that there was opposition, and we can guess what some of it was. But maybe in your answer, you could tell us a little bit what was the problem.
Well, one of the problems is, let me make it personal, right? One of the things when I was growing up, my mother always wanted me to go and work in business. And she would say, look, if you would get a job, you could maybe even get a jacket. And if you were really good, you'd get a car, right? We were a poor family. So, and when I rejected going into business and went on to academia, my mother was appalled, right? And so all of my life growing up was trying to say, well, you're going into the science because you love the science. It was like going into a priesthood, right? You were giving up all those blandishments of owning things. You were doing it just for the pure love of science, not of God. So that's, for many of us, then it was a very spiritual thing to be part of this, and a very pure thing. So when somebody, here we had escaped from business, had escaped from my mother, and here was Herb coming and trying to say, oh, we're going to bring business back into the purity of academia. So we were wrong at the time, but that was, I think, the motivation factor. And I think that where we were wrong, I learned very clearly from a meeting that actually Keith helped me get involved with. I had actually, becoming an academic, had sold out a long time before, right? If I had used my own money to fund my research, I could be pure as I liked. But as soon as I accepted taxpayers' money to do my research, then I'd accepted an obligation. And I had to grow up to learn that. And Herb just grew up a lot sooner than I did.
So you all are talking about, as we're moving through the 70s into the 80s, there was this transition. There was the shock at the beginning, at least for some people who caught up. But as we all know, and I think Keith mentioned, it's not just the science and even the industry side of it. It also is the rest of society. And this is something that I, as a journalist, am fascinated with. we come up with these fabulous technologies, especially in our part of the world, but how does society integrate it? How do we make this actually happen? Because it's a lot more than just coming up with a great new idea. And so there were a series of laws passed. You actually went from the politics, which we mentioned, which was, at least in some quarters, was very anti-recombinant DNA. I mean, Teddy Kennedy, in fact, I guess was close to at least introducing some legislation that would have restricted recombinant DNA. But you went from that in the mid-70s, early mid-70s, to the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, and then a series of other pieces of legislation that really shifted things more in this direction that Reg was mentioning about, hey, this is taxpayers' money. And eventually, even though we all want to know about the basic mechanisms of biology and how we work, people want something back out of this. So maybe, Niels, you could talk about the significance of that legislation, especially the Bayh-Dole Act, and it might not be a coincidence that was the year that the patent was actually issued. I don't know if that was connected to the passage of that legislation or if that was just a coincidence.
I'm going to jump in here and tell you another story before Niels takes over. And you mentioned Ted Kennedy in the Senate. I was there. Bill Rutter and I and Paul Berg were asked to go back at our own expense and give testimony before a Senate hearing, chaired by Adlai Stevenson Jr. and Ted Kennedy and a number of their colleagues. And they were all set to just stop it. All the recombinant, just stop it, period. It wasn't like stem
Explain why
cell.
that was just for a second.
I'm sorry?
Explain why it was so dangerous to people.
Well, because they believed what they read in the newspapers. All right? And
So we were going to unleash. We were going to. Yeah, right. Who?
sorry,
Hey, I'm a
Dave,
reporter too.
You never said. Well, maybe you did.
But we were going to
in
unleash
any
monsters. They said.
But
Right?
then from the U.S. Senate, I went to got hauled before the UCSF Senate, and we went through that, and then the UCSF newspaper, they were all over it. So they were exciting times. But I think my colleagues Keith and Reg are right. It was a useful discussion. I never thought I was doing anything out of the ordinary. I mean, why do taxpayers support research? So it can be useful. You get a body of knowledge. That's what science is. And you're supposed to make use of it, and it goes back in history. So it was a difficult time, but I'd just like to say that it was a very useful discussion. As heated as it was still quite useful. I just went forward. Bob and I went forward, and I really didn't think about it, too much. I thought what we're doing is the right thing to do, so we did it. Sorry.
That's okay. Stan, real quick, and then we'll let Niels.
I just have, to answer your question, explain why there was so much concern.
Thank you.
I think it was because, well, let me get a little bit of a history. When Victor McElhaney published his article in the New York Times that Niels has mentioned that led to his phoning me, a number of scientists were interviewed, and they were all very excited about the prospects for the technology and what could be done. But several weeks later, the NAS committee announced its moratorium. And the whole notion of what was hazardous or about the area of DNA cloning changed overnight. The notion was that if even the scientists themselves are concerned, then the dangers must be horrific. The notion of scientists calling a temporary halt on their research in order to protect themselves against hazards that didn't exist, that were speculative, was unimaginable to the public. And the very fact that the moratorium had occurred, and this was all publicly, it was part of the maturation process that Keith has mentioned. But you have to put yourself back at the time. There was article after article which talked about the potential hazards that could exist, and there were organizations that fed on the fears of other organizations, and there was almost a hysteria at the time. But I can say the moment at which it changed overnight was the moratorium announcement, because people just found this unimaginable. Why would scientists call a halt on their research if even they're afraid? It must be absolutely terrible. I think that's why it happened.
Yeah. So Niels, how do we get from that to suddenly the
Okay,
Congress?
I have to insert something about the previous question, and that is the scientists being on both sides. At Stanford, if you want to work with a startup, you can leave for a year, up to a year, and your position will be available when you come back. But you're either 100% one side or the other, and your department has to agree. Who's going to take your classes? Who's going to take care of your graduate students, and so on? It's up to the department whether they can stay longer than 1 year. In fact, the current president of Stanford took, as a faculty member, took a year off to work with a startup and then came back.
So this is still the policy today. Kathy?
It can take up to 2 years if they are given permission. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's 1 year pretty much given.
Yeah. You can imagine how disruptive it can be for a department with losing a teacher and mentor to the students. Back to Bayh-Dole. Before Bayh-Dole, Stanford had negotiated agreements with the various agencies, particularly DOD, where we had NSF and NIH. DOE and NASA were very difficult to deal with, very bureaucratic. But with the main agencies that supported research, we had agreements in place already. But it was very important to have it apply to everybody, every school, and also there were restrictions in those, what we called IPAs, that were difficult to deal with. For one thing, they restricted the amount we could pay, I shouldn't say pay, where they would be entitled to a share of royalties to 15%. So we got guys from both sides of the aisle, Senator Bayh and Senator Dole, and we worked, gave testimony. And I recall when it came up to a vote, I was asked to go back the week before the vote and the day before the vote. There's a lot of changes, and they wanted to have input from university. And there were last-minute changes. DOE wanted to exempt, I think, 2 of its labs. And so we agreed to that because we hadn't got anything useful out of DOE, at least at Stanford. And then small business wanted to get on. So it became the University and Small Business Act. And then Senator Long came along, and he said he and his colleague were going to vote no, but they wouldn't filibuster or otherwise disturb the process. So I was in the Senate gallery when it was voted on, and it went very quickly, 98-2, and I was with Norm Latker, who is the head of patenting and licensing for NIH, and we went down and met Senator Bayh's legislative assistant in the Senate cafeteria and had a celebratory cup of coffee.
So it was not even a close vote
But
at the end.
the main significance, I feel, was it made industry aware that there's something valuable being created at universities, and it also made a lot of universities who didn't have licensing programs to think about establishing them.
So Kathy, you've been very patient over there. We're now moving up into, we'll just rip through the 80s there and jump into the 90s.
I was around in the 70s.
Yes. But I don't think you were in.
I was. I want to tell you that.
Oh, okay. Tell me.
I applied to Genentech, and I would have been the 7th employee, but my background was mammalian cell culture, and they wanted bacterial cell culture at the time only. So they didn't take me.
And you've wanted to tell Herb that all along, right?
I had nothing to do with it.
Well, I wanted to ask though. You took on the role at Stanford in the tech transfer office in the early '90s, and I want to move us here. And by the way, in a few minutes here, I'm going to open this up for questions. So I hope we have a lot of people out here that can ask some great questions. But how did this all play out by the time that you were in a role like Niels in terms of tech transfer? I mean, Stanford is obviously one of the most famous places on the planet for where tech transfer takes place. But how did this play out by the '90s? Was it already settled in a sense, or is there still tension there?
So again, you think I'm younger than I am. I grew up in the 80s in the tech transfer office. I worked under Niels. So my first case was the Cohen-Boyer case. So my first job that I hated at the time was to call all these companies, 73 companies, because we didn't have an invoicing system and they hadn't paid. And so I had to call them on February 15th or something and say, are you going to pay? And so I grew up in that era. We were very, very early on. I started at Stanford actually in '79. So I worked with a lot of the inventors in the early years. During the 80s, we were just evolving. Our office was very slow to grow. We had income coming in. We had to develop some policies and thoughts about how we would handle tools, how Niels wanted to do a patent tool pool around some of the tools that happened. Over time, the original agreement in Bayh-Dole was that we could only give a certain limited term exclusive license. And they eased that up, which enabled us to have a lot more freedom to give exclusive life of the patent terms for, let's say, drugs. So that was really helpful. I think the Cohen-Boyer program, the licensing program, set up a model for how we could do non-exclusive licensing broadly and get these tools out broadly. And that still resulted in a debate that's still happening now about what to do with research tools. And the NIH has put out guidelines on what they want us to do with research tools. But sometimes, the guidelines don't fit the actual situation, and sometimes many of these developments still need a lot of investment by companies to bring it forth. And so we might still give an exclusive license on a research tool if that's the best way to get the technology out there. I don't think everything is resolved still. I think it's still very controversial. We get articles even today or this weekend in the New York Times about conflict of interest and what is the university's role in getting technology out. In my mind, half the people want us to be closer to industry, and the other half thinks we're too close to industry, and it's not a good thing. We had a meeting several years ago, maybe 3 years ago, with the dean of the med school, the then dean of the med school, and he wanted to sort of canvass the thought leaders of the medical school as to whether they thought we should be closer or farther away from industry. And honestly, I thought it was divided 50-50. It was a rigorous debate, even at that time. So I don't think it's resolved. I think everybody has their side.
It's probably not so bad if it's 50-50. I think maybe if you had it one way or the other, it might still be. But let me, in fact, I want to open up the questions here in a couple of minutes. But let me ask about maybe incentives now for younger researchers, for people who don't remember these battles, the era that we're talking about, but are living now with what has shaped and evolved. Do you think the younger researchers these days are they in it for the pure research? Or are they in it for becoming entrepreneurs? What happens when you all are, especially maybe again Keith and Reg, who are working closely? What do you hear when you're talking to the younger researchers? What are they thinking about these issues?
Well, I think that the lights have come on with the potential to be able to carry curiosity-driven fundamental research all the way to application. And that's a tremendously exciting prospect. And so in my own view of this is that the young people who enter our Entrepreneur Center and work with QB3 to carry an idea to a startup phase are basically exercising that option that is now in front of them to be able to, and that option wasn't available early on, and so we want young people, we want everyone at UCSF, but young people in particular who are training, to be able to visualize that entire continuum that extends from their curiosity about a biological process to something that can actually reach application. Whether they themselves carry it across that whole spectrum is actually less important than whether they see that those opportunities are there. They may be uninterested and let someone else pick up that ball, so we want to be able to create a culture that enables that. But I think that young people really see this as just a part of the opportunity to really be able to think boldly and carry ideas all the way to fruition.
So one of the things that was surprising for me in sort of the 30 years or so after Herb started Genentech was, in fact, so we would boast that we started 60 companies from UCSF, but that was over 30 years. That was like 2 per year. And if you look at the cost coming in, that was something like 1 company per $20 million of federal investment. That wasn't very good. And so actually only in the last 10 or 12 years has the culture really changed at UCSF. And part of this is because of Steve Burrell running this course with Charlie Craig, which has really helped to say to our students, it's okay, it's now, we actually encourage you to start companies. And so we now have lots of them wanting to start. But let me just say of 3 things that work out in terms of being, what are motivators? The first thing we thought would be a motivator was to create, they're short of venture funding, early seed stage funding. So we created our own venture fund, in which we now run. And in fact, there wasn't such a big demand. We were really surprised. We thought, and Brooke Byers thought, we'd be swamped by demand for our fund. We weren't. We find it difficult to come up with 4 good companies to fund per year.
This is out of UCSF.
It's actually out of the larger
QB3,
communities, includes
right,
Stanford,
okay.
Actually, because we have Stanford people in our portfolio. What really surprisingly worked, just looking at where the data shows you, when we started this thing of what we call Startup in a Box, which Adriana, who's up at the back, I think, organized, where we actually follow on from what Steve does and then add services to the students. We help them to incorporate. We help them to do their small business grants. We help them to freedom to operate. We take graduate students and postdocs who know nothing about being industry. Taking this service, it really swamped us. We thought we would do 15 a year for the last 2 years. We've done over 70 a year for the last 2 years. So really, that was the place where the student demand, not into the venture fund. And the other thing that was a big surprise to us was the need for startup space, right? If you needed to get your company started, you need to have lab space. Where did you find it? And how can you keep your burn rate down low so that you can manage to start with a good idea and a credit card? And that turned out to be really very, very important. We did a little experiment with 1 room, filled it up with 6 companies within a year. As of about 2 months ago, we had 62 companies in our incubator network. You might say, well, are they all being successful? Anybody can incorporate. Last year, they brought in 150 million into the Bay Area, right? In angel small business grants and venture investment. So that works, right? And actually, the demand was still so large that we've now taken a little incubator space. We've taken down in the dog patch. We've taken an old broken down building, converted it into more incubator space. Did that 3.5 weeks ago. We're now 2/3 full with 23 companies decided to come in. So where really is there demand for is this hands-on help and services and space to start your companies.
Yeah, no, as a journalist, it's interesting to see all the experiments really happening because it's continuing. And, obviously, there's this incredible difficulty and challenge between coming up with a basic discovery. I mean, you guys, in a way, got lucky because your discovery was that important. It generated, I was reading here, $35 billion of revenues and over the years and hundreds or thousands of different companies. That hasn't happened. That hasn't always happened, but it's partly because we need to continue to rework this model. But I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to get hopefully some questions from the audience. We are living in curious times, especially in terms of funding in these United States. And I'm wondering, back to our core question here of these competing issues of academic peer research versus how we commercialize and translate. We are blessed in the Bay Area here to have some more resources than some other places. But as that sort of noose tightens, really, with sequesters and NIH budgets flattening or going down, which area needs to be emphasized the most? Or how do we deal with how we fund both of these areas with budgets going down?
I have a comment on that. I don't see it really as a conflict between academic pure research versus commercialization. I think that most people in universities really are interested in hypothesis-driven research, and they carry out the research to address the particular scientific questions they're interested in. And then sometimes out of their research comes the realization that there's some practical applications of what they've discovered. I think that's really the process that is carried out, I think, at most universities. It isn't that people make a decision, oh, I'm going to do academic pure research or I'm going to do commercial research. I happen to sit on a committee at the medical school called the Conflict of Interest Committee, which is a committee that reviews the potential conflicts between academics who have made discoveries and have commercial interests, either consulting interests or startup company interests, and they declare those potential conflicts, and there are standard procedures for dealing with them. So I guess I have some perspective on the way the process is happening today, and one can see by following the activities of this committee on a month-to-month basis that my colleagues at Stanford are doing interesting and important scientific research, making important discoveries, but also some of them recognize that out of these discoveries come opportunities for commercialization. And one of the things that exists now that didn't exist 30 years ago is that they realize it. And so that they're aware of this, and they're aware of what the potentials are for maintaining the academic environment in an appropriate state. They declare their conflicts of interest, and some of them need help in resolving them, and that's one of the functions of this committee.
I would be leery about involving graduate students with companies. They should be focusing on their work. And from the point of view of a licensing office, when people are directing their research toward commercial application, we tend to get incremental discoveries. And they do, and we try to get them in that window of application as soon as we can. It's the big ones that pay for the entire program are the result of undirected basic research.
I have to say I disagree with that, Niels. One of the most exciting companies that we have here is Refractory Materials, started by 3 graduate students who finished their degrees, started the company here. And what they're doing is transforming the textile industry by having silk secreted from bacteria, which they can spin, they can make water washable silk in. So they can transform the whole of textile industry by putting it into fermenters and taking it out of mulberry fields. And this was done by graduate students.
You said they got their degrees.
No, but they had to sort of think about it. They started thinking about it and taking Steve's courses when they were graduate students. But then, of course, they got their degree.
But perhaps to reconcile these two apparently conflicting points of view,
Thank you, Stan.
Conflict of interest rules, at least at Stanford these days, is that graduate students cannot be involved in commercial research. They may think about that and may start a company as something like Google or something like that after they graduate, but while they're in an academic laboratory, they cannot be involved in company activities, or nor may they work on projects that their advisors may have an interest in related to a company activity of the advisor. So that's one of the conflicts which is an absolute no-no at the university, so that may satisfy you, Niels, and also address Regis' point.
I think that the issue that you raised, David, is important to frame in the context of basic research versus applied research. And Vannevar Bush talked about this in his essay, The Science and Endless Frontier, in 1945. President Obama repeated the same message in 2009 when he came to talk to the National Academy of Sciences, which is that basic research may not yield a result for a year or a decade or ever, that's what Obama said. And that when it does, it benefits not only the people who paid for it, but the people who didn't. And he said that's the reason that the private sector won't support basic research. And he went on to say, and that's the reason that the public sector must support that. So the funding for basic research, for which there is still a tremendous need, really needs to come from the federal government and will be done predominantly in academia. And if anything, we're seeing a retrenchment of industry from doing basic research in the current economic climate. So all the more reason why it's essential that it be done in academia, supported by the federal government. But with the opportunities that we have for application, it really then calls upon all of us on both sides to be able to craft interfaces between the two that allow that progression, that continuum to really prosper.
Yeah, in fact, circling back to the first question in the beginning here, Herb, if you hadn't happened to walk down in the right week for the bacteria, we might not be sitting here right now. So serendipity and chance certainly plays an enormous role, and you obviously, in all fields, biology in all fields, you have to leave that open. And you look back at the broad sweep of history of the last 50 years in this country, this progress and this progression we've been talking about has really kept that alive. And that, my only real fear right now is that we may start squeezing that with some of the funding priorities of the gentlemen and gentlewomen in Congress. So we've got a few more minutes here for questions. Steve?
So Niels, maybe you could lay out for the audience for a minute the thinking on the terms of the patent, because you said relatively low terms that everybody licensed it. Had you said relatively high terms, everybody may have said, well, we'll just ignore that and we'll challenge the patent or whatever. But I think the fact that you set relatively acceptable terms for industry, virtually everybody licensed that technology. You want to talk about that at the moment of time? That
Sure, I can do that. I remember a hot day at Stanford in the old buildings there that are this thick with sandstone. After a week of hot weather, they get very warm. Scheduled a meeting in the Graduate School of Business conference room because it was air conditioned, and I brought a lot of people along. Were you at that meeting, Kathy, then? Not there then, but I got consultants. I contacted Lou Wolk, who had just retired from Merck as the chief patent guy, to get an idea of how terms go in the pharmaceutical industry, and provided that to this group of people, including patent attorneys and so on. But I realized as the discussion went along, was basically the buck stops here. Nobody, this is without precedent where you have a patent that starts a new industry. But the reason the terms were where they were is that we're providing, Herb and Stan provided a tool. And the architects who are going to design the molecules and then the companies are going to take it further along are part of that process. And of greater value to a company is that transformant that expresses that important protein. And they should be getting more royalty than we did. After many months later, after the license agreement was signed, I was at a conference, and two separate representatives of biotech companies, or pharmaceutical companies, said that they were going to challenge our patent, and but because of the royalty where it was, they decided not to. And even though we had, it was a very low getting in, we had an awful lot of people that were entitled to pay us earned royalties. It worked out, $250 million.
I want to add a thing that Bobby Swanson came up to me at one meeting and still think you would have made more money if you gave an exclusive license to Genentech.
That reminds me of a meeting with, is Tom Kiley here? There he is. I went up to San Francisco, and I think it was outside Embarcadero 2, had a meeting with Bob and Tom. Tom was then a lawyer with Lion & Lion in Los Angeles, and we talked a bit about the patent and so on, and then Bob or Tom said, well, we understand you're thinking of going for exclusive, but we just want to carve out a small area. We want an exclusive to all polypeptides. And I laughed, and it took about 5 or 10 minutes before Bob and Tom laughed, and we went to have a cup of coffee.
Yeah, that part of the discussion, for a while, Niels may remember that Stanford did consider, as Kathy has said, giving an exclusive license to Genentech. And Niels and I, you forget that, Niels. Niels and I had a discussion about this. And I said, Niels, this is a general technology. And he said, well, Stanford may make, as Bob had said to Kathy, more money ultimately by giving Genentech an exclusive license. But ultimately, you made the decision not to do that and to license it generally. And I guess there were about 460 some licensees before the patent expires. And whether or not that was the best way financially for Stanford or not, it certainly did establish a deviation from the paradigm of licensing inventions exclusively because companies have to put out an investment to develop that. This was a new type of approach, I guess, for Stanford, and some other universities have subsequently adopted it.
I'm wondering how many people in the room have been touched by, worked with this technology, this patent, this science, this recombinant DNA science. Just sort of curious. Pretty much everybody. Is anybody not? Okay. Oh, our microphone man there, but you're next. And you probably have had your life touched by it, actually. May not know it. Anyway, maybe, do we have time for maybe one more question? Okay. Anybody? Bruce, yeah.
Thank you. Great panel. And through the work that all of you have done, I would actually posit the thesis that the tech transfer mentality, both for the academic community and the business community and for the institutions that actually get it, that is a major strategic advantage and asset for the U.S. And so I'm curious, because we all work around the world, if you see anything like this going on anywhere else. Science is science. It's not limited to this country. And I think we have such an amazing system and mentality and almost a culture in place. I don't really see that it has taken that deeply in a lot of other countries that do create a lot of good science. Do you see that?
I think there's a lot of cultural reasons why it's not happening elsewhere. If you look just at Stanford, and I'll include Genentech too, companies that within 5 years to 10 years become actors on the world stage. Tell me of a company in Europe. I can think of one, SAP, that started from ground zero. For the most part, they're existing companies. Go to Japan. When MacArthur broke up the predecessors to the Keiretsus, a guy called Morita and a guy called Honda started companies. Tell me one since then that has gone from zero to the top. You're right. We are unique. But I do think now Israel and India are players on this stage.
And I would say that the rest of the world is trying to catch up. They're way behind, but they will eventually get it because part of it is a maturation of the culture.
Part of it is they come here, too. I mean, it's very, very diverse. Anyway, with that, I think we're about to go out and have some cocktails, and I believe our panelists will still be here, right?
So if we can give a quick round of applause to thank our panelists.